This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. Today, we're discussing writer Gordon Merrick. William Gordon Merrick was born in a suburb of Philadelphia on August 3rd, 1916. The younger son of Rodney King Merrick and Mary Cartwright Gordon Merrick. The Merricks were comfortably upper middle class. Gordon's great-grandfather, Samuel Vaughan Merrick, had been the founder of the Pennsylvania Railroad and a philanthropist and member of the American Philosophical Society. Gordon attended the Episcopal Academy for high school, where he excelled in the dramatics club and became editor-in-chief of the school's weekly newspaper. It was also there that Gordon had his first same-sex experiences. For over a century, Merrick men had attended the University of Pennsylvania, some of them even serving on the university's board of trustees. But Gordon decided instead to go to Princeton. Based solely on his academic performance in high school, Gordon would not have been admitted. But his influential maternal grandmother, Clarice Marston Billups, with whom Gordon was close, pulled strings to ensure he was let in. At Princeton, Gordon again immersed himself in theater, quickly becoming one of Princeton's leading men of the stage. He spent a lot of time as well in New York City. And at the end of his junior year, he decided to drop out of Princeton to pursue a Broadway career. Gordon's big break came in 1939, when he was cast as Richard Stanley in The Man Who Came to Dinner, a comedy by George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart, which debuted at the Music Box Theater in New York City. It was everything Gordon had dreamed of, but after a year, he quit the play, several months before the show closed. He never fully explained his reasons for quitting, but he did later say that the monotony of playing the same role night after night was part of it. Whatever the reasons, Gordon never returned to Broadway. After Broadway, Gordon worked as a reporter, writing for the Washington Star, the Baltimore Sun, and finally the New York Post. By this point, the United States had entered World War II, and Gordon longed to be useful in the war. He was rejected by both the Army and the American Field Service. But in the fall of 1943, he learned about a new government agency, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, run by William Wild Bill Donovan, which was the precursor to the CIA. Gordon's acting abilities and his command of the French language were attractive to the OSS, and they brought him aboard in spring 1944. First, sending him to spy camp, and then, in July 1944, shipping him overseas. In southern France, Gordon was disguised as an army officer and assigned a mission to turn double agents. It was intense and demanding work, and Gordon's skills were put to good use. At the same time, he was gathering excellent background information for his future novels. After the war ended, Gordon resigned from the OSS and moved to Mexico, where he lived with an Air Force lieutenant named Bob Richardson. It was there that Gordon began seriously writing. He wrote his first novel, The Strumpet Wind, in less than 5 months, basing the story on his experiences in intelligence work during the war. The novel was published by William Morrow and was a critical success. In 1946, Gordon and Richardson moved to France, where they lived openly as a couple. Gordon continued to write novels critical of the U.S. When he couldn't find a U.S. publisher for his second novel, he published in France instead. By his third novel, he once again found a U.S. publisher. Things had begun to sour in his relationship with Richardson, and in 1956, Gordon met an American dancer named Charles Hulse, and they fell in love. After a time living in New York and San Francisco, Gordon and Hulse returned to France. And then, in 1959, they bought a house on Hydra, a Greek island where they ended up spending most of their time, and where they became a part of the elite set of the island. When Jacqueline Kennedy visited the island in 1961, Gordon was her guide. Throughout the 1960s, Gordon continued to write, but he started to have trouble finding anyone to publish his work. Throughout the 1960s, Gordon continued to write, but he had trouble finding anyone to publish his work. Perhaps because of that rejection, Gordon decided, finally, to put a gay character at the center of his novel. He had written many gay characters in his past work, but they had been supporting characters. In 1970, Gordon published what would become his best-known work, The Lord Won't Mind, a gay autobiographical novel, which includes a happy ending for the main couple, Charlie and Peter. Publishing an openly gay novel was not an easy task, but Gordon's literary agent, Monica McCall, convinced Bernard Geis to publish it. And The Lord Won't Mind was on the New York Times bestseller list for 16 weeks in 1970. Despite the commercial success, however, the critics were less impressed. That would remain a theme for the rest of Gordon's career. Eventually, he wasn't able to find hardcover publishers for his works at all, but Avon Publications published paperbacks of his books to continued commercial success. In 1976, Gordon and Hulse bought a house in Sri Lanka, spending much of Gordon's remaining time there, in addition to France and England. Gordon died of lung cancer in March 1988, leaving behind a devastated Hulse. In 1991, Hulse donated a collection of Gordon's materials to Princeton University, an essential step in our ability to know the details of Gordon's life. Joining me now to help us understand Gordon Merrick and his writing is Dr. Joseph Ortiz, an associate professor of English at the University of Texas at El Paso, and author of the 2022 book, Gordon Merrick and the Great Gay American Novel. Hi, Joe. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so I am delighted that you have introduced me to Gordon Merrick, who I sadly had not heard of before, but I'm glad that I have now. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, I love the story you write in the book about how you first came to know Gordon Merrick's novels. So I'd love if you could talk about that, but then also how that led to you actually writing a biography of him.
Sure. I'd love to talk about that. So I discovered Gordon Merrick when I was 14 years old, when I was living in Las Cruces, New Mexico. which is a medium-sized town about 40 minutes from El Paso, Texas. So at the time, this was 1987, so it was about a town of 60,000 people, so relatively small. And I was pretty certain that I was gay, but I didn't know any other gay people. And I didn't really know where I could find any information or books about gay people. And I was also honestly pretty introverted and bookish. And one of the things I would do during the summer was hang out by myself at the local shopping mall. And I'd spend most of my time there in the Walden Books, the bookstore chain that I believe went out of business some years ago. It just so happened that one day when I was browsing the general fiction section, that I came across a paperback edition of The Lord Won't Mind, which was Gordon Merrick's breakthrough gay novel that was published in 1970, and it completely blew my mind. I'd already looked for gay books at the local library and at the university library with no success, and suddenly here was this book proudly and explicitly advertising itself as a gay novel. The cover of the book was also pretty astounding. It had two good-looking men on it, very handsome and very preppily dressed, with a Princeton University building in the background. The cover alone, fulfilled every fantasy I had as a gay 14-year-old in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Eventually, I worked up the courage to buy the book, along with the one other Gordon Merrick novel that was in the store. And I read them voraciously. These were both novels in which a young gay man, after much trial and tribulation and a lot of sex, it has to be said, because Gordon Merrick's novels explicit sex scenes, these young gay men ultimately end up in a committed long-term relationship with another man. So that was a very powerful message for me in 1987. And it confirmed what I thought, or what I intuited, could be possible. But I had not, until that point, found any evidence of it. So the novels, which were the first gay novels I'd ever read, had a profound influence on my notion of being a gay man. And many years later, is that experience a lot of testimonials, a lot of anecdotes, where someone describes discovering by chance a Gordon Merrick novel in a Walden Books or a B. Dalton in shopping malls all over the country. But the idea for a biography of Gordon Merrick, of writing a biography, didn't come until many years later, when I was a graduate student at Princeton University in the early 2000s. By complete chance, I met a gay man named Rick Garcia, who was a writer in LA at the time, but who had done his undergraduate work at Princeton. So in the course of our conversation, we discovered that we had both read Gordon Merrick as teenagers, and we were both fans. And he mentioned to me that Princeton owned some of Gordon's manuscripts, because Gordon himself had gone to Princeton, and when he died, his papers were donated to the university. Now, I was not a student of gay literature or of queer history. I was a PhD student in the English department writing a dissertation on Shakespeare. At one point, though, I needed a break from my work on Shakespeare. So I decided to look up this collection that Rick Garcia had told me about. So I went through the process of going to the rare book library at Princeton and requesting the materials, looking them up. Well, it turned out that the Gordon Merrick papers at Princeton was a huge archive, boxes and boxes, that not only included his working manuscripts for the novels, but also his correspondence, his letters, his business records, his unpublished works, and most wonderfully, photographs of Gordon and his friends and family. Now, the novels that Gordon had published in the 1970s and 80s never included a photo of him. In fact, they included almost no information about Gordon at all. So I had read his novels, but I had never seen a picture of him. And I still remember the first time I used the Merrick archive, and I found this 1954 passport with his photograph in it. And here was this handsome, debonair man with piercing eyes, who looked as though he had stepped right out of the novels. It's just really captivating. Well, the more I researched the archive, the more I looked at those boxes, the more I realized that, in fact, Gordon based much of his novels on himself and his experiences as a gay man, including his early experiences in New York, where he was, living for a few years after college, first, trying to be a Broadway actor and then as a journalist. But then in France and Greece, where he was an expatriate writer, after World War II. And so once I started to realize just how interesting and how unique Gordon's life had been, I thought, well, this could make a decent biography, or at least a couple articles. And the other, I started the project, by writing a couple articles and publishing them. But the other reason why I decided I really wanted to write about Gordon was that the archive at Princeton, in addition to containing Gordon's papers, also contained a huge box of fan mail that Gordon had received throughout the 70s and 80s. These letters were a revelation for me. They attested to the huge impact that Gordon's novels had on gay men all over the country, and in many other countries where people had managed to get copies of the novels. And in some of these cases, these were readers who were not even gay men. There was a surprising number of women readers who had found Gordon's novels and had admired them so much that they were, saying just how much they loved and learned, about gay life from reading his books.
Yeah.
This was an aspect of gay literary history, essentially of gay history, that simply had not been documented. Certainly not part of the standard histories of gay literature and culture were available at the time. It was not mentioned in the anthologies of gay literature. Merrick was not included in the anthologies of gay literature, and still isn't. So I thought that someone needed to at least write about this history, at least document it. And it was pretty clear to me that no one else was doing this. No one else seemed to be interested in this. And I was pretty sure, and I'm still pretty sure, that I was the only person who had been using this archive at Princeton. So this for many years, this became a labor of love, because I stayed a Shakespeare scholar, and I am still nominally a Renaissance scholar. That's my day job. So this was something I worked on for years, and I contacted other people in the process, people who knew Gordon, or who might have known someone who knew Gordon. So this was something that I just worked on the side when I had time to do it. It wasn't really till the pandemic happened, and I had a lot more writing time at home, that I thought this is the time to finally finish the book. But I also decided to finish it when I did, because I got some very good advice from a mentor of mine who was very familiar with the project, who told me the Renaissance is not going away, but the people who read Gordon Merrick and remember his novels, they won't be around forever. So it's probably a good idea to finish the book now. So that gentle nudge was kind of the impetus that I needed to finally finish the book.
So can you talk a little bit about the difference between researching the Renaissance and, documents that are so old and looking at that literature and that language versus something that is in living memory? You could actually talk to people who knew Gordon Merrick and, what that's sort of like as a researcher, as a scholar, looking at that very different kind of work, different kind of history and archives. It
was a huge difference. And in large part for exactly the reason you said. I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people, which meant I had to talk to a lot of people. So one of the reasons I always say I became an academic in Renaissance literature, so that I wouldn't have to talk to a lot of people. I'm still that bookish person who liked to, go to the bookstore, for fun during the summer. But for this kind of project, I had to I had to find, people who could tell me more information about Gordon, because he was, as much as he put himself into his novels, he did not write almost any autobiographical material. He was just not he was not interested in writing autobiography. He was, strangely a very private person, when it came to interviews or published works. So I had to find other sources for details and facts about his life. And fortunately, there were still, people who were alive, who had memories of him. His longtime partner Charles Hulse was still alive and living in Galle, Sri Lanka. So I tracked down as well as I could. If I could find an email address, if I could find a phone number, whatever it was, if I knew someone who might have known them, I got in touch with them to see if they could, give me contact information. Yeah, at times it felt like detective work, and I became a real expert on Google, just trying to find little bits of information. But that was also the most exciting part of the project, and that was honestly the part of the project that I could have done forever. The book might never have gotten finished, because I loved those moments when I found someone who's just willing to just tell me everything they knew. They were wonderful conversations.
Yeah. So Gordon Merrick's life is just so fascinating. This Princeton time, this being on Broadway, being a reporter, being a spy, like it's just this fascinating life. But it leads to this interesting tension that so many of the reviewers say, oh, this stuff he's writing is so fantastical. And yet he's writing what he knows. He's writing his life. Can you talk a little bit about that tension and sort of what that meant in his writing?
So it is a real tension in his novels, because on the one hand, there's a lot of really rich autobiographical information, especially when he writes about what it's like to be a gay man in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. But he had very little experience with gay culture after that period. In large part because he was living in either Greece, we're in a small island in Idra for much of the 60s and 70s, or he was living in Sri Lanka, for the last decade of his life. So he had, by that point, very little contact with the kind of gay culture that the writers for Gay magazine or Vector magazine were writing about in the 70s and 80s. So the gay critics and the gay writers who were very, very active in America in the 70s and 80s, they were very much focused on what was going on, usually in the big cities, in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that was a culture that Gordon really knew very, very little about. But it's also what makes his novels so interesting. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and what I try to emphasize in the book is that there is history here, but you have to get at it at a slightly different way. You have to sort of kind of decode, some of the things that Gordon is doing in novels. At times, it's very thinly disguised autobiography. At other times, it's autobiography that's mixed with other things.
Yes, so he had really kind of an antipathy toward American culture, it seems, at times. Was not just unfamiliar with gay culture in the U.S., but kind of didn't want to be there, sort of fled, as you mentioned, lived in Greece and Sri Lanka. He's not, of course, the only person who does this. And you write about a lot of other writers and artists who are an expatriate community. And certainly we know after World War II, there's a lot of African Americans who sort of go and live in Paris because the culture in the US is so uncomfortable for them. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what it was he was escaping in the US, in American culture, what it was he found in these other places abroad?
Well, I think one of the things he was escaping was his family, which again is not that unusual for some people, but his family particularly made him feel, the pressures of what it meant to have certain social expectations of you, not simply as a as a man, for him, a gay man, the kinds of pressures that were very much felt, particularly in America in the 1950s, but also the social expectations that came from, being part of this, upper class family, that had, very, very deep roots on both sides of his family, both his father's side, which was this very, long established, Philadelphia family, and his mother's side, which was this, very established, Southern family. And it was pretty clear that, throughout his life, he had felt, the pressure of those expectations, and particularly his family, who were very, very socially conscious. So that he kind of used that, or he kind of saw that as a reflection of American culture and American capitalism more generally. That's a big reason why his early novels, so the novels that he wrote before the Lord Won't Mind, the post-war novels, pretty much can be described as anti-capitalist novels. Somehow American capitalism is always the big villain in these novels, and he saw Europe, particularly France, as this new possibility, as this place where society operated by different rules, where the things that made you important in America didn't so much apply. And a big part of the reason was that he was able to find, these other literary and other artistic communities, both in France and definitely in Idra, which became a destination for expatriate writers who were also, by America or England or Australia. He found that as a place for a new kind of life. And practically speaking, he was able to live fairly openly as a gay man in these places. He found, pockets, he found, groups of people who knew he was gay, who very much knew the nature of his relationships with the two men, who he was together for much of his life. And they, for the most part, fine with it. And the few people that weren't fine with it really couldn't do very much, other than maybe make a snide comment here and there. So it was a very, for him, that really emphasized, even exaggerated, the difference between American culture and European culture because of the communities that he found and the particular places where he found himself.
You mentioned earlier he's still not really sort of listed in the canon of, great gay authors. And it seems like during his life, he was often disregarded by not just sort of the mainstream press, not just the New York Times critics or whatever, but by the gay press as well. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the reasons for that? Why, although if you read him, can see that he's a great author, why he was dismissed?
Well, I wouldn't say he was a great author. I would say he's a pretty good author. So that's one of the things when when I'm asked about reading Merrick, or when someone asks me to recommend Merrick, I say it's pretty good, but it's not at the level of, say, Andrew Holleran or Edmund White or Alan Hollinghurst, who are just these really just beautiful writers who are just really develop, these very unique voices. Gordon always, saw himself more as this kind of Fitzgerald-esque writer with very, fairly stark prose, and he never really moved on from that. But he did a pretty good job of developing a very, elegant, very sparse, direct style of writing. But what I think made and still makes Gordon Merrick the kind of figure who doesn't get included, or certainly not emphasized in histories of gay literature, is that he was very immediately pigeonholed as a certain kind of writer by gay critics after The Lord Won't Mind came out in 1970. And a lot of that had to do with the fact was that they didn't recognize their own experiences in his novels, and so they immediately wrote him off as this melodramatic romance writer, who was just writing about stuff that really didn't apply to gay men. And that became entrenched so quickly that when he did try to write a novel that was connected to contemporary gay culture, so his novel An Idol for Others, which he published in 1978, was actually based on one of his friends, but was actually a large part of the novel is set in 1970s New York City and San Francisco. Even when he did that, the gay critics ignored it. They didn't even read it because they already had assumed that he was that sappy romance writer that they remembered from The Lord Won't Mind. And it didn't help that by that time his books were only being published in paperback by Avon, which really like to use these wonderful, sumptuous, sexy covers that were designed by an artist named Victor Gadino, who designed these who's still alive and who's still designing covers for romance novels. They're just really they're really exquisite, but they really also solidified this notion of Gordon Merrick as kind of a gay harlequin romance writer.
Yeah, and in being pigeonholed though like that, it seems like he did very well commercially. Being published by Avon with the paperback, that they did a great job getting his novel out there, and he was able to live pretty comfortably with that despite the lack of critical acclaim.
Absolutely. And this was a big tension for Gordon himself, because he really, to the end of his life, he really craved the prestige of hardback publication. He really wanted to be that kind of Norman Mailer-esque novel writer. And so he was always trying to find a hardback publisher, a respectable hardback publisher for his novels. At the same time, he enjoyed the checks that were coming in through Avon, because they knew very well how to market and distribute his novels. That was one of the really fascinating things I found when I was doing my research for the book, was that Avon very early on in the 70s had developed a very shrewd strategy, not only just for marketing the novels, but for distributing them. They actually had a very strategic plan for getting these books, into chain bookstores throughout the country, including, places in the South where it would have, seemed to be really difficult to sell gay novels, but also in rural places, like Las Cruces, where I grew up. They were actually very deliberate in the way that they marketed these novels, knowing that they would be able to sell thousands of them. They would be able to get them to a lot of people, and that these readers were very, very ready to buy them.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that it seems like the gay critics and stuff didn't think necessarily reflected their lives is this idea that two men would live happily ever after. And yet that is what Gordon himself experienced. So can we talk a little bit about his two long-term relationships, which, had he been legally able to, presumably would have been marriages, especially the second one. Can you talk a little bit about that, the kind of relationships that he had, and the importance of those in his life and his writing?
They were crucially important for a lot of reasons. So he was with his first partner, Bob Richardson, for 12 years. And this became absolutely fundamental, to the way he not only thought about himself, but also the way he presented himself. So when he was living in France, they were known as a couple, and they were accepted in their social circles as a couple. So I think it meant a tremendous deal for him, because it gave him it was okay. And I think it was also the case with his his next partner, who became his lifelong partner, Charles Hulse. They were known and accepted as a couple in their social circles and in their business circles. And it was clear that Gordon was by nature someone who was disposed to be in a monogamous, committed relationship. This isn't actually an issue that he represents in some of his novels. The idea that that some gay men don't need to be monogamous and are more comfortable with that. He was clearly not. He clearly was jealous by nature, and he found at least in Hulse someone who seemed to have the same attitude, and so they got along very, very well together, and they did try to at least secure some of the things that come along with marriage. So they legalized their relationship as much as they could. They one of the things they did was create a kind of corporate arrangement. They created a business by which all of their assets and including their intellectual assets were all contained within this business, so that when one of them died, all the assets, all the rights, would just naturally go to the other, which is exactly what happened. Because both their families were still living when Gordon died in 1988, but everything went to Hulse. So they were very smart in terms of what they could do legally. Even though as you said, it would be still many years before they could be married in the legal sense. But there are a lot of ways in which their relationship very, very much was like a marriage, although perhaps not so typical in that it lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, and then Hulse also became a writer, and Gordon was actually able to mentor him. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that is so fascinating.
It's very fascinating and very, very unlikely, because Hulse, for pretty much his adult life, or his younger adult life, he was an actor and a dancer, and those are really his only aspirations. And he was very good at them, and he got a lot of work in his 20s and his 30s, doing those. And the idea to write a novel, from what I can tell, really didn't enter the picture until he was much older, and after he had been with Gordon for many years. And I can only surmise that after reading and being around a writer like Gordon for that many years, he thought to himself, "Hey, I have something to write about too." And thought Gordon, writing about their own lives and their own experiences, and he thought, "Well, I'll try my hand at this." And he's actually not a bad writer at all. One book that he wrote, In Tall Cotton, is actually it's very well written, which I assume part of which came from the feedback that he got from Gordon. But it's also a good story. So he was also good at remembering things that had happened in his life, and remembering particularly those poignant moments, and was able to put them into a novel. Which again, and he was very open with this when I got the chance to meet with him in Sri Lanka back in 2012. And he was very explicit, that the novel was basically just a version of what he remembered in his childhood.
Mm-hmm. So you, at the beginning of the book, say that you're going to refer to Gordon Merrick as Gordon. And of course, as we've been talking, you've done that as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know that's a decision that people need to make as they're writing biographies, sort of how you refer to this main person you're writing about. So why did you choose to go with Gordon?
That's a good question. I at times I don't realize I'm doing it, and but it's very natural for me by now. When I was writing the book, first it was a practical matter, because there's so many Merricks, particularly in the first part of the book, where I trace Gordon's childhood and then his years in college, and they keep reusing the same names over and over in his family. So there's a lot of Samuel, Vaughn, Gordon, William Merrick. So the men in his family pretty much draw from a set of 4 names. So it was easier just to refer to Gordon, I was referring to him, and then kind of use the full names of other people in his family. But it also felt a little more natural to refer to him as Gordon when I was talking about the person. I did look around for examples too, and so one of my examples when I was writing this biography was Imani Perry's great biography of Lorraine Hansberry, which was really one of the one of the biographies that I really admired and tried to emulate in some ways when I was writing this. And she refers to Hansberry using her first name Lorraine. So I thought, well, if she does it in this brilliant biography, I can try it myself. But it's become very natural. I don't even realize I'm doing it. He's just Gordon to me.
Yeah, I struggle with it a lot when I'm writing introductions to episodes, in part because I write about so many women and they often have multiple marriages. And so their name is changing over time. And so, I struggle with that sort of, do I go with the first name? Which last name do I go with? So I appreciated that you were thoughtful about it. One thing I've mentioned many times on this podcast is how many of these would make great films. And not only is there no film about Gordon Merrick, but as far as I can tell, there is not yet a film of any of his books either. But I know that's something he tried for. Can you talk a little bit about that process and why we still have yet to see a film of his books?
Absolutely. And Ryan Murphy, if you're listening, you can reach me at the University of Texas at El Paso. I'll send you a free copy of the book. No, I quite a few people have, after I've talked about Gordon Merrick in the book, have said this would make a great topic, a great subject for a film. And I agree, and Gordon agreed also. At least, with The Lord Won't Mind, quite a few times he tried to get a film version, or at times even just a theatrical version produced, and a couple of times he got close, but it never materialized. There were a couple of projects that looked like they were going to happen, but ended up falling through. But I think now would be an especially good time, in part because there seems to be an interest in revisiting some of these earlier works, and I'm thinking particularly of the film version of the Boys in the Band, which was this 1969 play that was then made into a film. And for the longest time, the Boys in the Band, was treated like this embarrassment by a lot of gay critics and historians, because of the ways in which it represents gay men. But there seems to have been a change in the way that people look at these works, and there seems to be a real interest in now going back to them now with that distance of time, and seeing the kinds of history that they contain and that they reveal. History that in a lot of ways has not been really covered or has been forgotten to a large degree. And I think Gordon's work, particularly The Lord Won't Mind, as well as his own life, offers a really fascinating way of recovering some of that history that tends to get overlooked or flattened out by these larger Stonewall narratives about what life was like before Stonewall, before 1970.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be great if some film producers just started listening to this podcast and got lots of story ideas.
Which I'm sure they do.
So if you're listening.
Absolutely.
Well, for everybody else, how can they get a copy of your book?
So the book is currently being sold by Roman. So if you go to roman.com, I will say that currently only the hardcover edition is available. So I would strongly encourage anyone listening to get your local library or your university library to buy it. But I can say that in a few months the paperback edition will be published. So that will also be through Roman. So roman.rowman.com is the publisher. So that's where it's available right now.
Excellent. Seems a little ironic that currently you can only get a hardcover of a book about Gordon Merrick, but
yeah, I've had to have my own publisher experiences and have to learn a lot about publishing in my own right, and yeah. It still doesn't quite make sense to me.
Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
I'm just fascinated by how much of a sea change there's been in the way that gay romance is treated. It's going to be November soon, and so I'm already getting excited about all the Lifetime and Hallmark movies that feature gay romance. There was a time when A lot of gay writers, kind of really, turn their nose down on gay romance as a genre. But now it seems to be quite quite the fashion, and I think that's fantastic. And it's 50 years after, more than 50 years after The Lord Won't Mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this was really fun. Thanks so much for speaking with me and for introducing me to this fantastic figure and writer, Gordon Merrick.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. You can find the sources used for this episode at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review and tell your friends.